Welcome to Mountain Bike Express, and this week we're on the fastest course of the year for the third round of the 7-Up BMBF National Points Series. This is Caesar's Camp just outside Aldershot, and while the riders are getting ready for the main race, we are going to take a look at some of the girls with aspirations of a future place on the podium in the junior women's race. This week's course is the flattest of the year, but instead has miles of twisting single track, as well as short steep climbs and drops such as Sandy Hill and Brownloaf Hill. The emphasis will be on handling, power and tactics, as the racing should be close. Leading the Junior Women's Series with a win and a second so far was the Scottish rider Jill Struthers, who was soon out front, with only Rachel Picket of Saracen being able to stay with her up the climb on Cheese Hill. In third was the 1992 National Points Series winner Keeley, who has been struggling to make the top three this year, but was ahead of the national champion Specialized Helen Mortimer, who dislocated her shoulder in the second round at Newnham after a comfortable win in round one. As the leaders headed back down Cheese Hill, they were starting to catch the tail end of the veteran men, who had set off 5 minutes earlier, while the gaps in their own field were beginning to open.
Followed by the Ridgeback cyclist.
Jill, who is a strong all-round rider, soon pulled away from Rachel on the fast flat sections, and she knew that through the technical section Rachel, whose strength is climbing, wouldn't close the gap. In fact, Rachel's concerns were now behind her, with the Ridgeback rider closing fast on the single track. While a tentative Helen, who would normally be great on these types of tracks, was forced to take it easy and was dropping off the pace, though comfortably clear of 5th place Vivian Cox. By the time Jill was at the far end of the course, she had opened nearly a minute on Rachel, who wasn't looking comfortable on the descents. That spurred on Keeley, who had got Rachel back in her sights and was closing the gap. Meanwhile, Helen was obviously suffering on the rocky sections and appeared to have settled on her present position. On the steepest climb of the course at Sandy Hill, Jill was off and pushing, but she wasn't worried, as she knew she'd opened a comfortable lead, and with Helen out of contention, it was unlikely that either Rachel or Keeley would get back to her. By the compression towards the end of the first lap, Keeley had edged ahead of Rachel, and they were having a battle royale. We picked the race up at Brownloaf Hill midway through the second and final lap, and with virtually no climbing, therefore little chance of suddenly tiring, Jill looked assured of another win, so attention switched to the race for second, with Keeley trying to get away on the technical sections, but Rachel coming back on the flat. A mile from the finish, and Jill could have walked it in, eventually finishing 2 minutes up. But behind her, it couldn't have been closer, with the nature of the course providing us with a rare sprint finish, Keeley getting there first by half a wheel. So was Jill pleased?
I'm delighted, really. I'm delighted. It was a great course. I had a good run. I just rode the race the way I wanted to, and I did it.
I didn't think I was going to get her at first because she was way ahead, and I thought, well, if I look at the downhill, because she's not too good on the downhills, I thought I'll go for the downhills and I'll get her. And she started creeping away, and I thought, am I going to do it? And just at the end I seen, and I thought, well, that's, I've got to see her. I could see her in front, so I thought I've got to keep pushing to try and get in front of her, and I just made it at the end.
Jill's comfortable win improved her lead in the series, which she looks like taking, unless Helen can return to fitness. And to keep you in touch with the Junior Men's Series, Matt Guy again had a comfortable win after the expected challenge from Alan Gunner on his local course evaporated with a puncture when he had no spare to fix it. That allowed Ollie Beckingsale to move up and take the second place, 23 points, whilst the much improved Blackburn lad, Kevin Duckworth, in his best race so far, took third, which moved him up to fourth in the series. Matt appears to be in a different league from the rest of the field, winning by nearly 3 minutes, whilst Robert Thackeray will have been disappointed to have not made the top 3. And that leaves Matt with a commanding lead after 3 rounds. While we finally got some decent weather, the World Cup moved over to America, but still had to contend with the rain. On a slimy course, strewn with rocks and roots, the leading trio of women, Julie Furtado, Ruthie Mathis and Alison Seidor, all took tumbles in the woods. Furtado and then Mathis broke away from the chasers, while Chantal Decour got the better of Seidor. Caroline Alexander had led for the first half lap before slipping to 5th, though Furtado managed to stay on her bike more than most as she made it 4 out of 4. In the men's race, the sun had come out as they mounted the first climb, but the course remained slippery. To start with, it appeared as though battle would resume between Tomac and Frischneck, but Thomas regained control as Tomac slipped down the field. And it was Peter Rich who moved into second after wisely opting for a run down the woods. Though some riders like third place Dave Weens were riding with style, others such as fourth place Ned Overend were struggling. Warren Sallenbach made it 2 Ritchie riders in the top 5 as Frischneck took his second win of the season. With Mike Kluger not racing, that win put Frischneck back in the leader's blue jersey, whilst Britain's Gary Ford had moved up to 3rd. With Furtado still on maximum points, Seidor's 4th place was costly as the gap increased, and Caroline has slipped down to 5th. Despite a brief shower minutes before the start of the main event, it looked like the elite were in for their first dry race of the season as the men got underway. The main interest was in the battle between Diamondback's Nick Craig and Rally's David Baker in the overall rankings. And as the field hit the single track, it was David who led ahead of Gary Ford of Scott, Tim Davis of Alpine Stars and David's teammate Barry Clark. On this fast course, the field was not likely to split up much, with road tactics such as drafting being employed. So it was also essential that you weren't too far behind on the single tracks, in case accidents occurred causing gaps to form. The women set off a few minutes later without one of the main contenders, Louis Garneau's Caroline Alexander, who was competing in the World Cup events in North America. Picking up the men as they head up Cheese Hill, and you could see how the field had been stretched out by the single track. But it was still one bunch, and that's very rare in mountain biking. The rallies were gathering at the front, and were obviously planning on controlling the race from there. It would probably take an alliance between other riders to stop them having their way, as they quickly moved 3 riders into the top 4 positions on the way back down the hill, with Orange's John Clay, another good roadie trying his hand at mountain biking, in 5th. With the formation holding strong, Gary Ford was probably going to soon get sick of the sight of blue, orange and yellow. Behind them, Tim Galder-Schwinn and Tim Davies were both showing an improvement in form, but were beginning to lose touch with the lead group, though not as quickly as Marin's Paul Lazenby, who had been in 8th before this misjudgment, losing 10 places sorting out his bike. We rejoin the women's race with Mudcam on the single track. Jill Smith of Specialised, who's very good on the fast section, puts in a burst to take the lead ahead of Pace's Sean Roberts. And by the time they hit Cheese Hill, Jill has started to stretch out the field, with Deb Morell from Formula One holding second. Since Caroline is now out of contention for the series, Deb is in a very strong position with a win and a second so far. She also doesn't have to worry about Jill, who as a Canadian won't collect points towards the series. Sally Timmis was obviously benefiting from the flat course, having moved into 3rd ahead of Sean, Michelle Bergstrand of Stiff and Orange's Janet Wilkinson. on her way back down, and Jill had begun to open enough of a gap so that she could get out of sight on the corners, and this course has a lot of corners. We pick up the men at Caesar's camp on the far side of the course, and there was no change in the lead group, with Gary waiting for the rallies to try something. But behind them the chase was on, as Nick Craig decided he couldn't let the lead get any bigger, and moved into 5th ahead of Tim Gould, who would have hoped that he could have stayed with the leaders. Though Tim's girlfriend Jill was doing significantly better in the women's race, increasing her lead over Deb on all the fast flat sections. And Deb was also having to contend with a challenge from behind, as Sally, a track and road rider, obviously fancied her chances on this flat course. Behind them, Sian was again suffering under the early pace. By the time Jill had reached Caesar's camp, she had opened a gap of over 30 seconds on second place Deb. Heading up the steep climb of Sandy Hill, and the lead men were all managing to ride it, and there was no change up front, with David continuing to set a fast pace. Nick could see the leaders on the road sections, but had to suffer the frustration of not being able to close the gap, as the rallies were working together. As the lead group heads down through the compression, Mudcab goes along for the ride, and you can see how the bikes are being kicked around by loose rocks that are strewn over the course. Through this section, the riders will be in excess of 30 miles an hour, but they won't have time to enjoy the ride. Gary's in an awkward situation, as if any of the rallies make a break, he will have to chase them down, as all are capable of winning. But in so doing, they are tiring him, and could be setting up any one of them for the win. On a similar course at Clipstone Forest last year, they played the same game with Tim Gould, and eventually took all top 3 places ahead of the tiring Gould. If Nick could get in touch with the leaders, he would happily work with Gary, as they are both out of the same stable. But the rallies are aware of that, and hence are keeping the speed up.
Stuck behind.
As Jill heads up Sandy Hill, she's being hampered by the tail end of the men's field, who she can't pass on this single track. But with the chasers off and pushing in a battle of their own, Jill was still increasing her lead towards the end of the first lap.